Chapter 20. The Civil War. Introduction. In this lecture, you will learn the tactics and strategies used by both sides in the American Civil War. First, you will learn, however, the reasons that President Lincoln offered to the Southerners why war with the North made no sense for either side, and offered few, if any, advantages to either side, no matter who won the contest. Lincoln was hoping to dissuade the Southerners from starting the war, going so far as to say that he would not start it himself, that history would show that the North acted only in defense, to preserve the Union. Then you will learn why the Southerners started the war anyway. Next, you will learn about the importance of the border states, those states in between the North and the South, who remained uncommitted to either side, who both sides courted. Their role turned out to be a determining factor in the outcome of the war, and you will learn why. Next, you will learn about the strategic military advantages enjoyed by the Southerners, which were in fact so numerous and persuasive at the outset that even many Northerners doubted that the Southerners' will to survive could ever be broken, or that their sprawling cotton kingdom could ever be dismantled. Next, you will learn about the strategic military advantages of the Northerners, which were, in the long run, at least as numerous and as persuasive as were the short-term advantages of the Southerners, so that many Southerners were as fearful of annihilation by the North as Northerners were fearful of the survival of the South. Next, you will learn, with the hindsight that history always provides us, how the Southerners could have won the Civil War if they had done just a few things differently. It never was a question of luck. It was always a question of competence and cleverness. He who thought before he fought would win. That was one of the main differences all along between the Northern and Southern battle strategies. The Northerners fought like their only weapon was a hammer. The Southerners fought like their only weapon was a switchblade. We shall linger a while on that telling comparison. Then we examine the war at sea, particularly the war concerning the blockade runners that the British agreed to build for the Southerners, so that the flow of cotton to British mills would not be interrupted by the Union Navy, and the flow of cash to the Southern planters would not be interrupted so that the rebel armies could keep on fighting until the Northerners tired of the contest. After that, we will take an entertaining side trip to Mexico to learn what role that comic opera outpost of a country had in the American Civil War. It did have a role, which had more to do with the Monroe Doctrine than with the war itself. Back in the States, you will next learn the rather astonishing news concerning what President Abraham Lincoln was doing with, and doing to, the guarantees of civil rights and liberties enumerated in the Constitution and the Bill of Rights, in his quest to marginalize criticism of his war strategies. His excuse was always that it was just for now, and that no long-term threat to civil liberties was contemplated. Haven't we heard that in more modern times as well? You can impress your history teacher by writing a paper on Lincoln's civil liberties policies, either justifying or emasculating Lincoln's arguments as you see fit. Next, you will learn about the draft. Yes, as the war dragged on, both sides had to draft their young men to fight in it. It was the country's first draft. Always before, there had been enough enthusiastic volunteers to fight for the country, or to fight for one's state, or even one's colony in colonial times, so that nobody had to resort to a draft. And in truth, both sides were overwhelmed with volunteers in the first year of the Civil War, as Americans on both sides were encouraged and motivated by the rightness of their cause. But as the carnage dragged on, with no end in sight, no victory parade planned or contemplated, nobody wanted to go any more. The fight had become a meat grinder. So how did that draft idea work out? You will learn all about it. Next, you will discover how both sides paid for the war. No government saves up a cash surplus for war, and this war was no exception. But if Lincoln had to borrow the money, who would he borrow it from? The British? They were friends of the Southerners, whose cotton they needed for their looms. Who would Jefferson Davis, the rebel president of the Confederate States of America, borrow from? The Brits didn't want to loan him any money either, in case his side might lose. They just wanted to keep him in the fight for as long as the slaves would keep picking that cotton. Would the governments of the crowned heads of the various European states loan either side any money? They were all monarchies. Far from rooting for either side, they salivated at the prospect of the entire American experiment dissolving into chaos and ruin. And anyway, they were still miffed about the Monroe Doctrine, which had foreclosed any ideas they had about recolonizing any portion of the Americas. So how did Abraham Lincoln and Jefferson Davis finance the expensive Civil War? You will learn the answer to that question. And speaking of financing, what effect did the war have on the economies of the North and the South, just generally? We keep hearing in the modern age that war is good for business. Was it good for business then? You will learn the answer. We next move to the battle strategies themselves, for both sides. You already know that President Lincoln declined to initiate hostilities, forcing the Southerners to start the war. At the beginning of the war, you will learn what the Northern public thought about it, what the opinion was of the man in the street. You will learn about the first battle with the Confederates. They called themselves Confederates after the war officially started, and how that turned out. Then you will learn about Lincoln's larger war strategy, his 6-part plan to assure a Union victory. You will learn how the Confederates' seasoned top commander, General Robert E. Lee, responded to Lincoln's plan, and you will learn about Lee's own daring battle plan, which he created to negate Lincoln's strategy before it would have a chance to succeed. You will learn how and why Lincoln dreamed up his Emancipation Proclamation, and why he waited so long to use it. You will learn how effective it was when he did finally use it, and why his offer of freedom for the slaves did not apply to the border states, whose slaves longed for deliverance as much as did their brothers in bondage anywhere else in the Confederacy, and certainly deserved it as much. The Civil War was fought everywhere in the South, but for our purposes, understanding the tactics and strategy of several key battles is essential for understanding the success or failure of the overall Northern and Southern battle strategies. The Battle of Antietam is one of those key battles which illustrate the Northern big-picture war plan. You will learn why the Union had to win this engagement, how Lincoln characterized the outcome to attain a political advantage in the Northern newspapers, and how the outcome persuaded the rebels' top general, Robert E. Lee, to modify his own war plans to persuade Northern public opinion, just like Lincoln was trying to do. The American political process in the North, meantime, was not put on hold during the war, and candidates and incumbents had to stand for election or re-election, including senators and members of the House of Representatives in the pivotal fall of 1862. You will learn how the outcome of that election affected Lincoln's war strategy as well, and how the even more important election of 1864, when he had to run for re-election himself, changed his battle plans once again, and his ideas about what to do with the Southerners when the war was finally over, assuming, of course, that the Union side won. Back on the battlefield, meanwhile, you will learn about Lincoln's many and various army commanders, people he auditioned by having them go up against Robert E. Lee's skilled Confederate commanders, and Lee had some good ones, people like James J. Hill, James Longstreet, George Pickett, and Thomas Stonewall Jackson. Sometimes Lincoln's generals went up against Lee himself. You will learn the results, which would be amusing if they had not been so costly in lives and treasure. You will learn, in some detail, about the key Battle of Gettysburg, and why success there was another must-have for both sides. Only one side could win, and you will learn how and why it ended the way it did. Elsewhere, in other theaters of war, you will learn the story, and much of the biography, of Ulysses S. Grant, the one indispensable military commander in whom Lincoln had complete confidence. Grant's story, both personally and professionally, is stranger than fiction. Nobody could have made up a rags-to-riches, gutter-to-president biography. Yes, he became president after the war. Less likely to be true than the actual story of Grant's improbable life. You will meet him in this lecture, and you will meet him again later when he is president. Just now, at this point in our story, Grant's heroic exploits and commanding prowess turned the tide of war against the Confederates, and he wasn't even at Gettysburg when both sides had all the skin in the game they could manage, trying with gallantry and courage, which is the stuff of military legend, to bleed each other to death, while Grant was doing his own thing in another theater of war entirely elsewhere, succeeding with brilliance that is also the stuff of military legend, where Lincoln's top generals had already failed, by the way. Just another day at the office for Ulysses S. Grant. You will learn the secrets of Grant's successes. One of Grant's colleagues at West Point was William Tecumseh Sherman, now General Sherman, and you will meet him too. Sherman coined the simple phrase, "War is hell," and then, with Grant's permission, proceeded to prove the truth of that maxim as he executed his own battle tactics and strategies on the Confederates. You will learn what Sherman's strategies were and why they remained vivid in the memories of Southerners for 50 years after the Civil War had been consigned to the history books. Finally, you will follow along with Ulysses S. Grant and Robert E. Lee as these two legendary commanders finally confronted each other head-on in the closing months of the war, slogging away with the desperation of gladiators in the Roman Colosseum, knowing that only one cause, only one country, only one of them could survive, sacrificing whole regiments of seasoned and equally desperate soldiers to the maw of war, fighting hand to hand, day to day, inch by inch, right to the bitter, bitter end. In the end, after all the battles won and lost on all those battlefields that you can visit today and walk on and listen, if you want to the ghosts who linger near the places where men fell like chaff upon the threshing floor of the mill of war, in the end the whole universe of carnage and tragedy came down to just these two extraordinary soldiers, dueling daily for months with their wits and the tenacity of their devoted soldiers. You will follow, in this lecture, their months-long duel through the battles of the Wilderness, Spotsylvania Courthouse, Cold Harbor, and the Siege of Petersburg. You will be there on the final day when it all came down to Lee and Grant, seated across from each other in the parlor of a house owned by a grocer, Wilmer McLean, who lived in the sleepy Virginia town of Appomattox Courthouse, having moved his family there from another sleepy Virginia town, Manassas Junction, where his house had been damaged in the first battle of the Civil War. He had made the arduous move just to make sure that the war never touched him or his family again. McLean said ever after that the war had begun in his kitchen, which had been damaged at Manassas, and ended in his parlor at Appomattox, in spite of his best efforts to be anywhere except where the fighting was raging. It was an irony worthy of the pen of Sophocles. Lee surrendered the remainder of his tattered and exhausted army to Grant in McLean's parlor. Then Union soldiers paid McLean for every stick of furniture in the room, including the carpet on the floor, and left him to ponder the historic significance of the moment while they walked out with their souvenirs. And finally, no account of the Civil War would be complete without an account of the assassination of Abraham Lincoln only a few weeks later. You will learn how that tragedy happened. The Civil War changed the country in fundamental ways, and you will learn how future generations were affected by it, how it changed the national economy, the political and social structure at all levels, and even the definition of what it meant to be an American. The country has fought many wars since then, but none changed or defined and challenged our very existence as profoundly as did the war we fought against ourselves, the American Civil War. This is the one lecture you should hear again and again, long after the exam is over and your grade is earned, because it was, and it remains, the crucible of sacrifice which wrote in blood and fire the definition of what it meant to be an American for 100 years to come.